Hi there, my name is Green Teas. This is a very different video from usual. If you don't know, this is pretty much my job. I make content in a 3D video game called Koikatsu, and I mostly focus on original characters that I've made. And I decided to make a video that was going to focus on showing how I make my renders. A lot of people really like how I've done a lot of fancy lighting, as well as how I've made characters. Today I'm going to focus on showcasing how I have made a lot of my renders, and there's a bit of step-by-step processes on it, so I'm going to make this video to showcase what I do. Of course, first of all, I go into the character studio. I've loaded one of my characters named Zeezee. So I've pressed the F1 key. This opens up the plugin menu, and I go to look for something called the shader swapper. Mine is 1.3. You'll notice that the keyboard shortcut is set to right control, it's set to whatever. So what this does is this actually controls something that is very integral to how I make my renders. The reason why is because it's incredibly amazing when it comes to how it utilizes things like lighting, reflection, etc. I decided to choose a more action-y pose at the start. It turns out that it didn't really work out for me, so I did end up doing something more kind of winging it. I didn't have much of a pose to go with, but here you can see her in a military outfit, and I'm changing the mouth to be a little bit smaller. If you go into KKP in advanced mode, you can actually change a lot of features about a character. So I looked through all of these animations. These are the base game animations. They're not really what I want, so I decided to go to the Kohai animations. These are community-made animations, and they're really good. This pretty much is what I wanted to go with when it came to how I could pose items into her hand. Normally people use the T-pose, but I don't like doing that personally because I like to have a more natural pose to work with. Nobody's going to be holding a weapon in both hands and doing a T-pose as a reference. So I decided to go for an actual pose here. She'll be holding a gun in her left hand, and in her right she's going to be holding a knife. I usually go for pose number 12 for the hands when it comes to shooting because it's much easier to pose the gun after I get it into her hand, and it's easier to make a lot more corrections for the gun pose. Now I'm going to link the Colt to her left hand, and I want you to make sure whenever you do this, you go for the one that just says CF_J_ hand and then _LR. I decided to go for a shank because she's going to be in a very war-torn setting, so it's going to have this feeling of she probably killed a guy and this was her weapon that she used, some rusty rebarb that she tore off and put cloth around as a makeshift knife. Zeezee here, also known as 7Z, is from a war-torn country. I decided to go with a trench kind of look with the ruined city, but then I noticed that the ruined city was a little too unclear. So I decided to instead go for the City Ruins map that was made from, I'm guessing, one of the Project Diva games. I don't know exactly which one, it just says that it's from Project Diva. And these map mods are really good. I had to figure out which one was the one that could let me actually change the color of the map, so that way it could be colored very similarly to the trench over here. For this kind of overcast setting, I usually go for the Hunter's Dream, and it's mostly because it's the most dreariest looking, especially for something that's meant to be more of a wartime kind of thing going on. I think that's what makes this setting a lot more interesting to make. Because a lot of people, like I said, associate this porn game with porn. But where there is creativity, there is infinite possibilities. So this is the biggest part, the character lighting map. So this is pretty much why I have that shader swapper and the XUKMI shaders. You might have noticed when I was moving that dynamic light around, the gun and the shank were not affected. So the best way to do it is to go into the material editor, go into the parts that have this little drop down and say that you want it to be main item plus. At the very bottom there's the XUKMI shaders, and you can make it to where they are the plus shaders from this set, so that way they are affected by these dynamic lights. And it can be a bit of a pain. This is also the reason why I use the swapper. Whenever I port a character in, it may not have everything properly ported. Doing the same thing for the trench, I noticed that there's some weird geometry issue with the lines. If you turn off the outline on setting in the material editor, it won't show up. The intensity can be raised and lowered. Like I said, I usually go for a bit of like the very low intensity but high strength, while having the character light in the system being a lot lower than the usual. So I want to add some effects such as smoke and some embers to showcase that there is war going about. With that said, I use this rectangle to import some fire effects to give off that embery feel. For this part, I'm using elemental charging effects by a creator known as Engineer. These are very amazing lighting effects that I like to use to kind of cheat a little bit. I use the fire charging effect to give this orange glow. If you get rid of the particle effect by simply checking on the right on the workspace, you won't see the particle effect, but you'll still see the lighting effect. I add this colored shadow to give this kind of impression of a burning sky. I add Vinay because why not? To some it can add a little bit less, to some it may be too much, to some it means nothing, but to me, I think it looks nice. So you might have noticed that Zeezee's pose has changed, and that's because after a few revisions and changing of the pose, I realized that maybe a sitting pose would be a lot better. I also toyed around with the idea of her pointing at you to shoot you, but I personally felt it would have been a little bit distasteful, especially considering the current events at hand. So I decided to have it seem like everything's done. The war is not over, just the fight, and this is the only serene and calm that she has. I add draconic smoke, and I notice that it's not actually overlapping on certain parts of the background. So I go into material editor and I make it to where that the rendering queue is a lot higher. That way it actually probably shows. I do a few more adjustments to the image plate with the embers, and bam, I'm done.